My stepmom grounded me for something I never did, and the only way I could prove it was by turning my own diary into a trap. At first, I honestly thought I was imagining things, that maybe I was being dramatic, or paranoid, or unfair to someone who was trying to care about me. But when my dad started repeating private thoughts I had never said out loud to anyone, I realized something was very, very wrong. My name's Chloe. I was 17 when all of this happened, right in the middle of the pandemic, and I know everyone has weird pandemic stories. Some people learned to bake bread. Some people started online businesses. Some people shaved their heads for no reason. Mine was realizing my stepmom had been secretly reading my diary. You have to understand, my family situation was already complicated before any of this happened. My parents divorced when I was 12. It wasn't explosive or dramatic, at least not outwardly. No screaming matches in front of me, no custody war. It was more like this slow emotional separation that eventually became official. My mom is a doctor, an ER physician actually, and she works insane hours. My dad works in finance and has always been the stable schedule parent. So after the divorce, I split time between them pretty evenly. Then, about 2 years before this story, my dad married my stepmom, Melissa. Melissa wasn't evil. I want to be honest about something, because I think it's easy to paint people as monsters when you're hurt by them. She could actually be really nice sometimes. She'd buy me coffee randomly. She remembered little things about me, like the fact I hate tomatoes on sandwiches. She once drove an hour to bring me my debate competition outfit because I forgot it at home. But she also had this really immature side to her. If she felt left out, she'd sulk. If she overheard something she didn't like, she'd get passive-aggressive for days. And whenever there was tension, she'd immediately go to my dad instead of talking directly to me. That part mattered, because it meant I never really knew what version of me my dad was hearing behind closed doors. And during quarantine, everything got amplified. At first, I stayed with my dad and Melissa because my mom was working directly with COVID patients. She was terrified of getting us sick. I remember her wiping down grocery bags with disinfectant wipes and crying one night because one of her co-workers got hospitalized. So I stayed with Dad, which meant months in the same house with Melissa. No school, no breaks, no escape, just this weird tension slowly building under the surface. And through all of it, I kept writing in my diary. I've kept journals since I was 11. Every embarrassing thought, every crush, every fear, every angry rant, all in those notebooks. Writing was the only place I could say exactly what I felt without worrying about hurting someone or starting drama. At least, I thought it was private. Before things got bad, I actually thought Melissa and I were making progress. That's the weird part. There were moments where we genuinely felt like family. We'd watch crime documentaries together late at night. While my dad fell asleep on the couch halfway through, she helped me dye my hair during lockdown because salons were closed. We baked banana bread like every other human being alive in 2020. There were good moments, and I kept holding on to those moments every time something uncomfortable happened, like when she'd walk into my room without knocking, or when she'd make these little comments about my attitude in front of my dad that felt more humiliating than helpful, or when I'd tell her something casually, and somehow my dad would know about it hours later. At first, I brushed it off, because families talk, right? And here's the thing. I was a teenager. I wasn't exactly easy all the time either. I got moody. I snapped sometimes. I stayed in my room too much. There were definitely moments where I probably came across cold or dismissive. I kept coming back to that. Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe I'm just defensive because she's not my real mom. I tried really hard not to become the stereotypical evil stepmom story. But over time, these tiny moments started piling up in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. I'd write in my diary about feeling frustrated with Melissa. And then 2 days later, my dad would randomly lecture me about being more respectful. I'd vent privately about wanting more alone time. And suddenly Melissa would act wounded and distant. Once, I wrote about feeling embarrassed because she corrected me in front of guests. The next day, my dad sat me down and said, "Melissa feels like you resent her. And I remember sitting there thinking, how would she even know that? I never said it out loud, not once, but even then, I didn't fully let myself believe what was happening, because believing it meant believing someone was invading the only private space I had left. And honestly, that felt too awful to be true. Everything changed because of one phone call. I was staying temporarily with my mom again because cases in our area had started calming down. My mom finally felt safe enough for me and my younger brother to visit her house regularly again. I remember I was sitting on her back porch when my dad called me. It was late afternoon. Humid outside. I had this glass of iced tea sweating all over the table beside me. And right away, I could tell something was off. His voice had that tight, disappointed tone parents use when they're trying not to yell. He said, "We need to talk when you get back." And my stomach immediately dropped. I asked why. There was this pause. Then he said, "Melissa told me about what you said." I remember physically sitting up, straighter, because I had no idea what he was talking about. Then he repeated it, a sentence. Word for word, something I had written in my diary 3 nights earlier, not texted, not spoken, written. And that moment, honestly, made my skin go cold because it wasn't just similar. It wasn't paraphrased, it was exact. I could picture the page in my head immediately. Blue ink, left side of the notebook. Tiny coffee stain near the bottom corner. And that's when it hit me. She had been reading it, not once, not accidentally, repeatedly. I barely remember the rest of the conversation because my brain was racing too hard. I hung up and just stared at the backyard fence for what felt like forever. Part of me was furious. Part of me felt sick, and another part of me still didn't want to believe it, because accusing someone of that is huge, especially someone married to your parent. Here's what nobody tells you about blended families. Sometimes you start questioning your own instincts because you're so scared of being seen as the difficult kid. I kept thinking, maybe there was another explanation. Maybe I forgot saying it out loud. Maybe she glanced at one page accidentally. Maybe I was overreacting, but deep down, I already knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every weird interaction from the last few months, every lecture from my dad, every oddly specific comment, every moment. Melissa seemed offended by feelings I had never shared, and the more I thought about it, the worse it got, because diaries aren't just notebooks. They're ugly thoughts, temporary thoughts, emotional thoughts, things you write because you need somewhere safe to put them. I had written about feeling lonely, about hating quarantine, about being angry at my dad for moving on faster after the divorce, about missing how things used to be, things I never intended anyone else to read, and now I was imagining Melissa flipping through those pages while I was asleep or showering or downstairs eating dinner. I honestly felt violated, but here's the thing. I also knew how crazy the accusation would sound. Without proof, my dad adored Melissa. And to be fair, from his perspective, she looked concerned and caring. If she brought him something troubling from my diary, he probably thought she was protecting me. I want to be honest about something. There were moments in my diary where I sounded dramatic. I'm a teenager. Sometimes I wrote things like, "I hate everyone in this house after a bad day." Not because I literally meant it forever, but because journals are emotional dumping grounds. So if Melissa was reading isolated entries without context, maybe she genuinely thought she was helping. That thought messed with me, because it blurred the line between concern and betrayal. Still, it didn't make it okay. And that's when I started thinking about how to prove it. At first, I thought about hiding my diary. Then I thought about confronting her directly. But I kept coming back to one problem. If she denied it, my dad would believe her, not me. So I made a plan. And honestly, I still don't know if it was immature or clever or manipulative. Maybe all three. I wrote a fake diary. Entry not subtle either. I made it dramatic enough that someone reading it would feel obligated. to tell my dad. I wrote about sneaking out with older friends, drinking, riding in a car with someone intoxicated. Stuff I would literally never do. The entire time I was writing it, my hands were shaking because part of me felt guilty, like I was setting a trap, but another part of me kept thinking, if she respects my privacy, none of this matters. Nothing happens. I left the diary in my room exactly where I usually kept it. Then I waited. And waiting was awful. Every sound outside my room made me tense up. Every time Melissa walked past my door, I wondered if she'd gone inside. For 2 days, nothing happened, and I actually started thinking maybe I'd been wrong all along. Maybe I really was paranoid. Then on the third night, my dad called while I was out with friends. I'll never forget his tone. Cold, controlled, furious. He asked where I was. I told him. Then he said, "You need to come home, now. No explanation, just that." And in that instant, I knew. The drive home felt endless. I remember gripping the passenger seat while my friend drove because my stomach hurt so badly. When I walked into the house, my dad was waiting in the kitchen. Melissa was standing behind him, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact, and my dad immediately started lecturing me about reckless behavior. About lying. About safety. About disappointing him. Every single thing he accused me of came directly from the fake diary entry. Every word. And weirdly, the strongest feeling I had wasn't anger, it was heartbreak, because now I knew for certain I didn't even defend myself at first. I just stood there, staring at Melissa. And I think she finally realized something was wrong because she looked nervous almost. Immediately, my dad kept talking. Grounded. No, car privileges. No seeing friends. And all I could think was, she actually did it. She actually read my private thoughts, handed them to my dad, and watched me get punished for them. Then Melissa spoke up quietly. She said, "I was just worried about you. And honestly, if she had apologized right then, maybe things would have gone differently. But instead, she doubled down. She started explaining how concerning the entry was. How she thought I might be spiraling emotionally. How she felt responsible for telling my dad. And here's the thing. Part of what she said sounded reasonable. If a teenager really wrote those things and they were true, an adult probably should intervene. That's why this whole situation got so messy emotionally. Because her concern might have been real, but the way she got the information was completely wrong. I finally interrupted and asked one question. How did you know any of that? Silence. Actual silence. Melissa glanced at my dad. My dad looked confused. Then she said something like, "I found it accidentally," and I remember feeling this rush of anger because there was no way, not with the amount of detail she knew, not repeatedly. So I told them. I told them the entry was fake. Every single part of it. I said I wrote it specifically because I suspected Melissa had been reading my diary, and the second those words came out, everything exploded. My dad immediately accused me of manipulating the situation. Melissa started crying, actual tears, and suddenly I was the bad guy for testing her. I kept coming back to that moment afterward because part of me understood why they were upset. What I did was deceptive. I intentionally baited someone, but at the same time, what other option did I have? If I'd confronted her directly, she probably would have denied it. And without proof, I would have looked paranoid and dramatic. The argument lasted over an hour. At one point, my dad literally said, "Why would Melissa invade your privacy like that?" And I remember laughing, not because anything was funny, but because I couldn't believe he still didn't see it. Melissa eventually came into my room alone later that night. She sat on the edge of my desk chair and apologized, softly. But even her apology felt strange. She kept saying things like it sounded serious and I had to tell someone. Not, "I'm sorry I violated your trust." Not, "I shouldn't have read it." Just justification, and that hurt more than I expected, because It made me realize she genuinely thought she was entitled to my inner life. After she left, I locked my bedroom door and cried harder than I had in months. Not because of the grounding, not even because of the diary itself, because I suddenly didn't feel emotionally safe in that house anymore. The next morning, I packed a bag and called my mom. I didn't even tell my dad beforehand. I just said I wanted to stay with her for a while, and my mom immediately knew something was wrong from my voice alone. When I got to her house, she sat with me at the kitchen table while I explained everything. Every detail. The phone calls, the repeated comments, the fake entry, the confrontation. And for the first time since all this started, somebody believed me instantly. No hesitation, no defending Melissa first, just belief. And that's when I realized how exhausted I'd become from constantly second-guessing myself. My mom was furious, not screaming furious, but cold furious, Dr. Mode furious, the kind where her voice gets quieter instead of louder. She called my dad that night. I wasn't part of the conversation, but I could hear pieces of it through the wall, words like boundaries, terse and completely inappropriate. Dad called me afterward, trying to smooth things over. He said, Melissa had good intentions. He said families make mistakes. He said I also crossed a line by setting a trap. And honestly, he wasn't completely wrong. That's the part that still bothers me because I did manipulate the situation. I manufactured evidence instead of having a direct conversation. But I kept coming back to one question. Would anyone have believed me otherwise? I still don't know, and after that phone call, something permanent shifted between me and my dad. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like a crack forming under pressure. Because when I needed him to trust my instincts, he trusted his wife instead. I stayed with my mom for almost the rest of that year. Technically, things eventually became civil again between me and Melissa. We weren't screaming at each other. Holidays still happened. We could sit in the same room, but it never fully recovered. I stopped writing in physical journals entirely, which honestly makes me sad, because journaling used to feel safe for me. It used to help me process emotions in healthy ways. After that, every time I opened a notebook, I imagined someone reading over my shoulder. Even now, years later, I still password protect everything, and my relationship with my dad changed too. I love him. I do. But there's this lingering feeling that he needed undeniable proof before taking my side. And once that feeling exists, it's hard to completely erase. At the same time, adulthood has made me see more gray areas in this story. If Melissa genuinely believed I was doing dangerous things, I understand why she panicked. If she thought I was in trouble emotionally, maybe she convinced herself the invasion of privacy was justified. And I want to be honest about something. Teenagers can absolutely hide serious problems from adults. Parents and step-parents do have responsibilities when safety is involved, but I keep coming back to the same thing. The issue wasn't concern, it was trust. Because once someone starts secretly digging through your private thoughts, especially repeatedly, it changes the entire emotional dynamic of a home. You stop relaxing. You start filtering yourself. Constantly, you start wondering, what parts of you are still actually yours? And maybe my trap was immature. Maybe it escalated things unnecessarily. Maybe I should have confronted her sooner instead of testing her. Can admit all of that, but I also think people sometimes forget how powerless teenagers can feel in situations like this. Adults control the house, the rules, the narrative. And when you already suspect nobody will believe you, desperation makes people creative. So now I want to ask you this. If you suspected someone was secretly reading your most private thoughts, and nobody would believe you without proof, would you have handled it differently? Would setting that trap make me manipulative? Or was it the only way to finally expose the truth?